numbers here.
John, Christian, welcome to Bloomberg House.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us so early, and thank you for all of you for joining us so early in the morning. As Mark was saying, my God, what a volatile world we live in. It seems there's a new crisis every morning, well, every couple of hours. We barely have time to deal with one, and we're on to the next one. And what this tells us is we need a new formula for resilience, one that helps us take smarter risks, take more responsibility, deliver results, all the while the future refuses to cooperate. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to discuss a new formula for resilience with both of you, because that is very much the theme here at Davos. John, I want to begin with you. This idea of reframing resilience. You know, we often talk about resilience when something goes wrong, but how should leaders perhaps think about resilience differently and think of it as a strength, as an advantage rather than a constraint?
Well, good morning, and thank you again for having us. We're looking forward to the discussion here. It's a moment of polycrisis, right? It's you know, Christian and I were chatting earlier a little bit about some of the more global crises we're in leadership roles through, whether it's the global financial crisis or more recently the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But now the themes, and you mentioned things are coming at businesses and leaders all around the world every single day. But the themes we have ground wars, trade wars, culture wars. We're still in the relatively early stages of a technology revolution, which has enormous promise and opportunity, but a lot of risk associated with it as well. Immigration, growing social issues, and the frequency of extreme weather events, wreaking havoc on society and economies all over the world. And so it requires a mindset shift for sure. And I think, too often, and particularly leading into the pandemic, both governments and businesses were reactive and not proactive about managing risk. But it's a time to think about it in a different way.
To rethink it. Christian, I want to take you back to 2008, and you had just joined the global executive board of JLL, and you had the Lehman collapse, right? But that was one big crisis hanging over your head, just one at that time. These days, like we talked about it, you have something new hitting you every couple of hours. So how do you as a leader prepare for compounding risks?
Yeah, we probably have to see resilience and how we deal with resilience like training a muscle. Sure. When we had the GFC, the muscle was relatively untrained, and it felt like the worst which could ever happen to us. Today, with all these multiple crises John was just mentioning, we have actually gotten used to deal with all those things. And I think, as you can see also with the reaction over the last 3 weeks, I mean, global markets have been astonishingly calm with all these things which just happened in January this year, because we have all been trained and we developed that muscle and to stay calm and to see what does that really mean. And I think that is the really interesting bit when you think about all those things which have happened over the last, let's say, 5-10 years. What has really massively changed strategy for companies, impacted strategy for companies, and what is just noise for companies? And it's very little from our point of view, from a JLL point of view, where we really had to adapt strategy. I mean, it literally boils down to Brexit and how we are operating in China.
So how are you approaching it differently? Do you wait a bit? Do you wait a beat to let the noise calm down? Is that what you've learned, is pause, or just what's the shift?
I think it's a combination. You obviously run your company in a slightly different way. I mean, it's your choice, but we have decided at JLL that we run the company with far less debt than we used to, just to have more resilience in the system.
Sure.
So that is a choice you are making. And then you have prepared your organization for those kind of challenges, because there are way too many that you can deal with them when they come up from the top. It cannot be John or Christian who's dealing with all of that. You have to really spread it out, because we have so many at the same time. And so there's an organizational change which has happened. But then there's also kind of the understanding that we are strong as an organization and we can deal with pretty much everything. I mean, in our case, we were founded in 1783. A lot of things have gone wrong since 1783, and we are still there.
That's right.
1783, we're young. We're 1871.
Yeah, see, the junior here.
John, you work with CEOs and governments from around the world. What do you think, according to you, what are leaders most underestimating or perhaps misunderstanding about the risks we face at the start of 2026?
I will say my conversations with CEOs since the pandemic in particular have shifted. They're much more risk aware today, trying to better find that balance between efficiency and resilience. And I think, again, too many businesses were over-indexing on efficiency, prior to the pandemic. Christian gives, one example about his capital structure, right, and trying to manage that, a bit differently today than in the past. So I don't think there's one thing, and I will say I feel the direction of travel on this subject is quite good. So I feel good about that. Now it came as a result of some major global crises. If there's kind of one thing I would say, and there's obviously great promise, around AI and what that technology can mean to our businesses, what it can mean to the world, what it can mean to health and safety. But I don't hear enough discussion, and I'm encouraging more discussion from our colleagues with clients around the impacts, the risks around AI. There's a lot of discussion about job loss and the impact to economy and society, which is obviously an important conversation, and also about misinformation and disinformation, but less discussion about cyber risk as it relates to AI. And so, that's an important consideration for businesses.
I definitely want to spend some time talking about AI, but you both mentioned the pandemic. So Christian, let me ask you, what's the one lesson you learned from the pandemic that affects or shapes how you build differently? What's the biggest lesson?
From a leadership perspective, it was probably really understanding how important it is to be able to collaborate and to be with your colleagues. I mean, we have a geographically spread out top leadership team living in different countries and parts, and we were all at home. And the first meeting, we were able to come together, almost all of us. One colleague who lives in the UK wasn't allowed to travel. I dragged them all into a hotel in Silicon Valley for 3 days and I said, even the ones who live in that area, don't go home. We all stay together.
Right.
And it was almost like a family reunion. We were so incredibly happy that we were able to be together again. Because, there were a lot of difficult decisions to be taken during that pandemic. And if you do everything only over a video conference, you kind of feel how the tension is sometimes rising. And so understanding the difference between just being able to communicate via video or phone or being in a room together, that is probably the biggest lesson I took out of that. I didn't appreciate before maybe how important these personal relations are, even at the top leadership level.
Do you agree, John?
I do. It was an enormous leadership challenge for sure. And one of the things that's really been interesting for me, whether it's the global financial crisis, 9/11, having working in New York at that time, and then more recently the pandemic. How critical communication is, getting the teams together, sharing with your colleagues what you know, what you don't know, some of the risks you see, but setting priorities. And the clarity that can come around those priorities in a moment of crisis can be quite powerful, and you can get your organization quite focused very, very quickly. But you also want to learn from the event, right? And so we learned a great deal about the seasonality of cash flows and how we needed to manage that going forward. We changed the stress testing that we had done around certain scenarios, and we're in a very resilient business that was, on a relative basis, wasn't impacted all that much. But we're also in the business of advising clients around risk, and so how do we also learn from this event and do a better job going forward, advising companies like Christian's, so that we can help them be more resilient going forward. We were very mindful of pandemic risk inside of our company, given given what we do. We actually had a risk financing program that was available that we had out in the marketplace, and for a wide variety of reasons, it wasn't accepted and kind of went by the wayside. But we've learned a great deal from that event, and I think it makes us stronger, but it's also made us a better business in how we serve our clients.
I want to talk about AI for a moment. And CEOs today are making big decisions on AI, but there's still a lot of unknowns. Even AI throws us surprises all the time. Christian, how do you decide? I mean, how are you leveraging AI at JLL? How are you incorporating it into your business strategy?
Yeah, it's across the board. I mean, at the end of the day, what we are doing is based on data. So I sometimes joke we are a data company, and we invested heavily into our data platform 10 years back. And I had to respond to many questions from shareholders about the return on investment, and it wasn't easy to demonstrate. Yeah. But now we are taking the benefit that our data is in really good shape. And so we have dozens of different efficiency projects running on AI. So the vast majority is still focused on increasing the efficiency and helping our employees to kind of leave those tasks behind them which they don't enjoy, very repetitive tasks, which are now very much driven by AI, so that they can focus on those things which are more innovative and more creative and hopefully more fun for them. But the next step is, and that's the much more difficult one from my point of view, that you are getting more to revenue generating through AI. And that really changes the way you have to operate, and you have to interact with clients, but also your salespeople. For them, it's a tremendous change. And so that's a tough one, and I think most organizations are still struggling with that piece.
I want to talk about climate for a moment, because it's January. We're 1 year on from the Southern California wildfires. It's hard to believe it has been 1 year since then. How much is climate on the mind of CEOs these days? We've been talking about climate. We had Al Gore sitting right here yesterday as well. So tell me, how important is climate, do you think, for CEOs from what you're hearing? And I'm also curious, when you dealt with the Southern California wildfires last year, how much has the cost associated with that from an insurance perspective gone up in the last 5 years?
Yeah, so obviously, devastating events to the communities impacted in Southern California last year. And, the rebuilding is really just beginning. So it's going to be a multi-year, process of recovery in that part of the United States. And, it's obviously a very cat-exposed area. The insurance industry is very well aware of those risks. So costs have gone up over a period of time, and they will continue to go up. We're not we don't have a major role in the mass market personal lines area, but we are an advisor to the high net worth clients in the area. So just absolutely devastating. It'll be roughly a $40 billion insured event, but economic consequence to the region of somewhere in the range of $100+ billion. And so there's a big gap there in risk financing, a big impact to a community that, right now you would think would want to be investing in technology and infrastructure, but is going to be investing in, and is investing in recovery. There's a lot to learn from that event. There's a lot to learn from every weather-driven catastrophe, and so we're trying to advise communities, homeowners, business owners, in an effort to build better resilience into that community, because it is exposed to wildfire. It will happen again. We know that will happen again, and obviously, you'd like to have a much different outcome the next time. And so communities weren't completely prepared, and many homeowners weren't very well prepared as well. And so we're trying to advise them in a way to make some different choices so that the outcomes can be different.
Christian, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. How do you build, keeping climate change in mind? What does it mean to design buildings that can withstand climate change? Is there a situation, a scenario where you can use real estate and buildings to actually reverse climate change?
Well, that's a big ask. What you clearly see that you have now the first buildings in the world which are carbon plus. They take more carbon out than they produce in their operations. The trouble is that the construction of buildings is already producing that tremendous amount of carbon. That's why the refitting of existing building from a climate point of view usually makes much more sense than taking them down and building a new one. But those who have built new ones, you have the ability now to produce a lot of energy. You know, think about a large logistic facility and you have solar panels on the roof and they usually produce more energy than they consume in the building. So those type of things are happening. I think it's what we learned through the pandemic is that you have to create overall more resiliency in a quarter. And resiliency is not only from a climate point of view, it's also from a livability.
Sure.
And what we've seen, those quarters where you have only kind of office parks were hit the most post-pandemic because people didn't come back. They found it very dull to get into an office park, and whereas those mixed-use areas, they came back the best. There's this one saying post-pandemic, which we always say, an office has to earn the commute.
Very true.
So you have to really make it so inspiring, exciting that people are willing to take the commute to come to office. And some are still struggling on that basis.
Yes, it still lingers.
And no, I was going to add, and it's not just the properties in our clients' portfolios. It's understanding secondary impacts to your business as well to build effective resilience. So understanding supply chains, how your supply chain may be exposed to extreme weather, right? So one of the things we try to advise clients on over the years is really understanding those effects. The pandemic, of course, heightened supply chain risk for businesses, and so we developed a tool that we've brought to market, that an AI-powered tool called Centrisk, that helps clients build a digital twin of their supply chains and how they may be exposed to extreme weather events. And then, of course, with the trade war this year, we added a trade simulator to that tool so that you can build, again, more resilience into your supply chains around trade-related risks. So examples just of how risk is compounded, over the last several years, and how businesses need to think about how they're thinking about those risks differently.
So John, historically, insurance was mainly seen as risk transfer. How do you help clients think about risk proactively so that they're better prepared and they don't have to, wait till there's frankly a catastrophe? So how can they be better prepared proactively?
Yeah, well, our risk businesses seem to be, the brand of them are better known, for procuring insurance on behalf of our clients. But if we're doing our job effectively, it's sitting down with Christian's team, making sure we help them understand all of the risks that we see, given the data that we have in advising so many companies all over the world. So understanding the risks to begin with, taking steps to mitigate those risks, then thinking about what type of risks they want to retain, and then transferring and getting financing for risks in the market for the tail risk that remains. And so it's really an outcome of a process around risk review. And so when we do our job effectively, it's not about buying insurance, it's about managing risk.
One thing I want to talk to you both about is working with governments, public-private partnerships. Christian, what does effective public-private partnership look like from your point of view?
Well, I think everybody has a role to play, and everybody has a specific knowledge. And so in our case, we are literally the intermediary between the interest of the public and then the interest of private businesses. And so there are multiple points where this comes to play. When you think about a developer, for a developer, time is money. The moment they start investing, the IRR is kicking in. And so speed to development is very important. So you can discuss with local authorities how they can approve the building permit much faster. And we have developed ways how we can entertain that There's a pre-discussion of what is being built before the developer actually kicks in with his spending money. That then when it comes to that point, that the approval comes very, very quickly. That's just one way. But it's also when many communities are lacking finance and they cannot invest into infrastructure. So you can create a program where the infrastructure is actually being paid by the developer. Obviously, there's something in return for that, but it helps both sides. And to entertain that and to find a common language is something where we can be of help.
Sure.
So there are some really terrific examples of public-private partnerships in the insurance industry to manage risk around the world. In the UK, where you live, in the United States, where I live, around terrorism risk, some extreme weather in different parts of the world. When I'm meeting with government officials, where we operate all over the world, I'm trying to make them also more aware of some of the risks that they may unknowingly be financing. And so, the pandemic is an extreme example of it, right? Government stepped in an emergency and began to write checks to keep businesses and alive and the economy moving. We have the opportunity to cooperate and collaborate in advance of events like that, so you have a more orderly process through severe risk scenarios. But I mentioned Southern California, the protection gap, just in that event. Last year, we estimate 2025 insured losses for extreme weather events, $125 billion. The economic impact of those events is going to be 2x that, about $250 billion. Huge gap that is largely being financed by governments. Of course, it won't all be financed. Some will suffer some severe financial consequences. Think about an extreme cyber event, and I'll talk to government officials and say, you're going to end up financing that risk, and there's surprise and shock, to that. And I said, well, you're not going to let small businesses go down, medium-sized businesses go down, where you have constituencies. And so anyway, the ability to get in front of those events and collaborate with governments. I'm a capitalist at heart. I believe in the private sector and the role that the insurance industry can play in financing these risks, but there are certain extreme scenarios that really require thoughtful partnerships. And I would also add that in some communities around the world, we've developed innovative risk financing, parametric-driven products where communities in advance of events actually have procured insurance to cover that gap.
Do you think boards and CEOs are sufficiently accountable today for resilience outcomes? And do you believe that resilience should directly be tied to executive compensation?
Well, I think poor risk management has consequences, and the tone starts at the top. As Christian mentioned, though, it can't just be he and I. We've got to create a culture where you're balancing, again, risk and efficiency. And so given the severe consequences of events today, arguably leaders, will feel it in their compensation, whether directly or indirectly, because the consequences can be quite severe. But I think it's critical that a board and leadership teams, executives inside and with board governance, are aligned around what the top risks are, have a risk management framework, and are constantly stress testing that framework and really identifying key priorities to manage the risk.
Let's end on a note of optimism. At the start of 2026, what opportunity are you most excited about or hopeful about for this year?
Well, I would go back to the opportunity technology is providing, and specifically the AI, generative AI is providing. It's a massive challenge. It's also a massive opportunity.
Yes.
And if we go beyond our immediate businesses, think about the opportunity AI is providing with regards to dealing with some of the most terrible diseases, cancer and whatsoever. We will really leapfrog over the next couple of years due to AI, and that is really exciting. And then it will also help us to overcome some of the challenges we have with demography in most of the Western countries. I mean, most Western countries are shrinking. So who's going to do the work? We will need more technology to deal with all the work, to keep kind of our wealth. And so on that end, I'm very positive. I would just hope that the world lets us focus on the real problems and not on all the noise we have to cut through at the moment.
That's a very good note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us, John, Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.